Hello, my name is Andrina Oliveros. I am a student of Universidad Central de Venezuela. I am currently doing a master's in English as a foreign language, and today I'm going to be presenting my current research paper in the area of psycholinguistics called Prior Linguistic Knowledge of L1 and L2 Influencing on L3. It's an error analysis review in English as a foreign language learning. In today's agenda, we're going to start off by indicating the introduction. We'll move on with background information on the research topic. Then research questions and the objectives will be presented. After that, we will analyze relevant literature that corresponds to this study. Then I will explain the methodology, the findings, final remarks, and I will finish off with the presentation of all the references used for this investigation. Let me introduce this topic by explaining that everyone in life makes mistakes, makes errors, and it's not something to be viewed as bad, because an error and a mistake is something that shows us or gives us the opportunity to learn that we're not doing things right, and therefore we can correct ourselves and do it better. The same thing happens with language. When we analyze errors and mistakes in people's speech, the idea is not to point out at the subject who is making these errors or these mistakes. The idea is to use these problems in order to make the student aware that he's making mistakes or errors and improve his overall speaking abilities or language production in general. It is important to understand that an error is something people say wrong or write wrong, but they don't have the ability of correcting themselves. A mistake is something that people say wrongly or write wrongly. They realize it and they can make quick corrections. For example, I just made a mistake. At the beginning, I used the word wrong, but it should have been wrongly, because I'm talking about actions. I'm describing an action, so I should use an adverb. This is the difference between an error and a mistake. An error is something that people don't realize that they're making, so therefore someone has to point that out to them. Instead, a mistake is a slip that happens, as Brown says, 2007, as Brown says, that it's just a slip, it's something that comes out naturally, but the person who says it can quickly make a correction. In this moment, I just did two mistakes. 2007, no, it's not 2007, it's 2007. And I should have used wrongly instead of wrong. Background information about the research topic. Okay, so let's see. First, language acquisition. In theory, there's lots of study on first language acquisition, but people or researchers have not yet identified exactly how a baby gets language. How is it that these babies can understand, can speak, can pronounce, can acquire grammar without studying? That is still unknown. But what is known is the processing of language in the brain. You see, Processing in language in the brain happens basically in two areas of the brain called Broca and Renkel. I don't know how to pronounce that area. But in these two areas is where language processing happens. And on the right side of the brain, you see the images. These images go to the Renkel area where comprehension is processed, and then the information is stored in the Broca area. Second language acquisition. Okay. First of all, it's important to point out that a bilingual person is who acquires a second language at the same time that they're acquiring first language. So these two languages are being acquired at the same time, at home, within the family. But also, it could be the case that you acquire your first language and then later, in other stages of life, you acquire a second language. But in this case, it would be through education. I mean, you learn it because someone teaches you. The same thing happens with third language acquisition. You either learn 3 or more languages simultaneously since you're a child at home because of family environment, or you learn your first language and then you pick up the other two in later stages of life through education, or you learn 2 simultaneously and then learn a third one later in life. Error analysis, as I explained in the introduction, error analysis is just the systematic way of analyzing the production of students' target language. The production in terms of errors and mistakes. Errors that learners are not aware of, and mistakes that they can quickly correct on their own. The research questions are: considering the phonology, lexicon, grammar, and discourse, which of these levels of English have more errors in the subject speech? 2, are the errors global or local? 3, how do L1 and L2 influence on L3? The general objective of this study is describe prior linguistic knowledge of L1 and L2 influencing on L3 in order to understand error analysis review in English as a foreign language learning. The specific objectives are: clarify errors of subjects English according to phonology, lexicon, grammar, and discourse, identify if errors are global or local, and finally discover how L1 and L2 influence on the outcome of L3. There were 2 major studies that were relevant literature to this research. The first one is titled L2 Activation and Blending in Third Language Acquisition, Evidence of Cross-Linguistic Influence from the L2 in a Longitudinal Study on the Acquisition of L3 English by Sanchez L. in 2014. And also, the second study that was relevant was Error Analysis of Spoken English Language among Jordanian Secondary School Students by Bankit Bayan, Nafi Nashor, ATH, Abdullah. This was done in 2020. This was a qualitative research. Let me give a little brief explanation about the subject. The subject is a woman who is bilingual. She learned Spanish and Portuguese simultaneously during her childhood with her family. Later in life, at the age of 5, she moved to Brazil and she continued on her education in Portuguese, but Spanish was still spoken at home. So this participant indicates that she considers Spanish to be L1 because she was born in a Spanish-speaking country and most of her mother family is from Venezuela. Only her father's side of the family is from Brazil, where they speak Portuguese. So she considers that her L1 is Spanish, L2 is Portuguese, and L3 is English. She learned English later in life during adulthood, and it was basically because of work purposes. We carried on this investigation by making an interview in order to analyze all the errors and all the mistakes done within her speech. As you can see in the chart, basically phonology was highly affected by L2 Portuguese. Her English sounds like Portuguese English. I mean, it has a very strong Portuguese accent. And in terms of grammar, the typical mistakes were omission of articles, not using prepositions of purpose correctly, like for, to, in order to, and so that, and also using active voice instead of using passive voice when it should be when referring to an object. Also, the speaker's errors were considered local. This means that her errors people that listen to her can still understand what she's saying. That's the difference between a local error and a global error. A global error is when when people don't understand you. But a local error is when you make mistakes, but people still understand you. Number 3, L2 Portuguese significantly influenced on her oral production, her pronunciation, as said. Well, surprisingly, for this study, I say surprisingly because I expected that most of the errors were influenced by L1 or L2 or both. But in this case study, in this research, L2 had a very strong influence over L3 and L1 in terms of pronunciation. But the errors that the participant made in grammar, they have no relation with L1 nor L2. The only influence is L2 upon L3 and L1 in terms of pronunciation. Now, the grammar errors that were made were basically due to lack of awareness, lack of memory, and a lot of anxiety that the participant has for wanting to speak English like a native speaker. So it is therefore recommended to give instructions on awareness of errors and mistakes so that proper mental efforts can happen during the controlled process that can be stored later in the memory through the automatic process, resulting in lower anxiety levels. These are all the references consulted for this research paper. Thank you very much for listening to my presentation. If you have additional information about error analysis, mistakes, or L2, L1, L3, please let me know on the comments below. Thank you. My name is Andrina Oliveros, and here you can see my contact information. Thank you.